Hello, my name's Roisin, and happy St Patrick's Day. Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. Today is, of course, St Patrick's Day, so I thought it was the perfect day to celebrate some books by Irish authors. I've done a lot of videos on this channel where I do top 10s, I've done top 10s historical fiction, top 10s books to travel the world, that sort of thing. I will leave my playlist in the cards above. So I was going to do a top 10 books by Irish authors that I've read. So I was looking back at the books that I've recorded that I've read, and then looking through lists of books by Irish authors to see which ones I had read so that I could talk to you about them. And I realised I couldn't do it. I couldn't get a top 10 books by Irish authors. I have read more than 10 books by Irish authors, but not all of them I want to talk to you about. Which, as someone who considers themselves to be Irish, I found to be kind of embarrassing. I definitely think I need to do a better job of reading books by Irish authors. I am clearly born and raised in London, but my parents are both Irish, and so Irish culture, Irish heritage is something that I kind of identify with, and so I need to remain a focus to read more books by Irish authors. So I'm going to talk to you about 5 books by Irish writers that I love, 1 poet that if you haven't read you need to, and then several books that I need to read myself by Irish writers. The first one I'm going to talk to you about is one that I did a reading vlog of reading really recently, so I'll leave in the cards above, and that is Normal People by Sally Rooney. Normal People tells the story of Connell and Marianne, who grow up in Carricklee. He is a working class but popular boy at school, and she is well off. His mother works for her family as a cleaner, but is strange and unpopular, and then they both end up going to Trinity, and we see things change when they are there. It follows their relationship, which they is kept secret while they're in secondary school, and their lives as they develop. I loved this book for so many reasons. I thought the writing was beautiful in a really understated, simple way. I loved the way that it flowed from one perspective to the other, because this book is a lot about communication and about how these two struggle to communicate through their trauma and through their mental health struggles. But the book is almost as if they are in conversation with each other. It is pushing through the silences that where they struggle to understand one another. It is also a book a lot about gender and sex, and also a book about class in Ireland in particular. It talks about the Celtic Tiger, and the effects of the global financial crisis on Ireland can really be felt, particularly in the beginning of the book. The culture in which it is steeped is very much about that, and also the culture of shame around sex. The idea of masculinity and how that affects Connell's mental health is also a really prominent part of this book. But it's a very simple, understated way. Nothing is too over the top. And I really felt like these two characters, although there aren't a lot of other well-developed characters, the other characters feel a lot more like concepts or ideas. They are representing something about class or about gender or about any of these multitude of other things. Connell and Marianne themselves felt so fully realised and really very real people. This book is very simply about these two people, and the way that they were developed I thought was incredibly well done. Next one that I read last year, and that is The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue. This is a piece of historical fiction set in 1918 in Dublin during the flu epidemic, and our main character is Nurse Power, who is a nurse on a maternity ward that is specifically for women who are in labour who have the flu. And this story is set over the course of 3 days. It also involves a skivvy, a woman who has volunteered to work at the hospital in this ward, but who has no medical experience whatsoever, and also a woman who is a doctor and was involved in the 1916 uprising. This book is incredibly, incredibly beautifully written and feels so well researched and really well lived. It was interesting to read during the coronavirus pandemic, because obviously it wasn't written then, but the way people felt and obviously there were things like, oh, you need to wash your hands and stay distant from people in order to stop the spread, which is true of all airborne viruses, but the way people felt and the way people reacted, and the xenophobia that was a part of it, and the fear-mongering, the people who were thinking it was overblown, all of that felt so real, and the tensions felt real, but also the characters were so beautiful. It is very visceral and gory in regards to giving birth, particularly giving birth at the time, and considering there have been recent reports about maternity and maternal health in Ireland in this time period and later, up until like the 80s, I think, the promotion of I can't remember the term, but where you cut the pelvis rather than have a C-section. And it also talks about the Magdalen laundries and the orphanages and the treatment of children, women and reproductive health in Ireland historically, which I think is a really important topic that it covers, but it does it in such a brilliant, beautiful way where you really get engaged with these characters. Next, Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell is a book that has nothing to do with Ireland in and of itself, but Maggie O'Farrell is an Irish writer. This is a book about the death of Hamnet, the son of William Shakespeare. And the death of Hamlet happens in the middle and is the nut around which this book is built. We start off with his feeling unwell and his experience of his childhood and his family life, where his father is absent because he's in London, but also flash back to the meeting of his mother and his father. And then we also follow the grief of the family. It's very a small book in the way that it's very much focused on family. And I think that that's really well done in this book. It very much feels like a lot of historical fiction is around like war and men, and this feels very much domestic, but giving it the same importance because obviously the domestic has such an importance in our life. And I feel like that was really well done in this book. I also feel like the study of grief and of motherhood and of motherhood and career, because Agnes in this book has a career as a woman who works with healing things, and how that is her motherhood is looked down upon because of that, I thought was really well done. And again, another book with a pandemic involved, which was interesting to read last year yet again, and the way that the plague travelled. Things have not changed as much since the 16th century as you would have thought they had. It is, again, an understated book with very beautiful writing. And then another book that I read last year, apparently all my books by Irish writers I read last year, this is The Island Child by Molly Aitken. This is a piece, again, of historical fiction set on an island off the west coast of Ireland during the 1950s, and then in Canada in the 1970s. Although the time period is kind of vague and less important. It is about this girl who lives on this small island, which is very rural, very bleak. There are no trees on the island, and all the men are fishermen, and the church has such strong control over the island, control over the way women act, but the men are shown to be believing in other, like, more what we would consider to be superstitions, but like older pagan ideas, especially in regards to death, the superstition around fishing and selkies. We follow the girl growing up, and then we also flash forward in the future to where she lives in Canada, and she has a daughter who is estranged from her. The story follows why she ended up leaving, the trauma that caused her to leave, and also what her life is like now, and how the things that happened on the island affected her in the future. Both a period of immense trauma, but also the sort of trauma of growing up in that rigid society that controls your gender so strictly. Women were tied to the hearth and expected to behave in a certain way, and there is a woman in it who is English and not from the island, who is kind of a selkie almost, because this book weaves in that kind of folkloric element, but who is judged so harshly by the other women on the island because her son doesn't know who his father is. And so it's very much about sex and very much about gender and the long-lasting effects that trauma has, and trauma being passed down through the generations. I think it's done in a really, really beautiful way. I like the sort of folkloric, very watery element to it. There is definitely a lot of references to water and to selkies, and to, like, there's kind of an underwater feel to it almost, a detachment, a disassociation that goes on during the book, and I think that it is really, really well done, and really beautifully explored. And then the final one that I would recommend, that again is not set in Ireland, but by a very, very famous Irish writer, and that is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is a little gothic novel about a man who is incredibly beautiful, and he meets artists and this other lord man who kind of corrupts him a little bit, and that what they meet one day whilst the artist is painting his portrait, and he wishes to forever be as beautiful as he is in that portrait, and that happens, and he leaves the portrait upstairs in his attic, and he goes through life doing more and more depraved and dark things, but it never shows on his face. His face always looks like when he was that youthful innocent, and we kind of explore the idea of sin and corruption, and it's very, very gothic and darkly written and really beautiful, and really, really atmospheric, and wonderful as a Victorian classic. But it is also a kind of a queer novel, because we know Oscar Wilde was himself queer, and there are elements of that involved in the novel as well. And it is also about art and music and love, and sort of selfishness. It's about what people do for themselves, and the way that can harm other people. It's a really good book. It's a really thrilling, gripping book, and very, very short. So I think if you're looking to read a kind of gothic classic this March, then maybe read The Picture of Dorian Gray. And then in terms of poetry, the poet that I think that you need to read if you haven't already, although if you are from the UK and around my age, there's a good chance that you have because it was on the GCSE syllabus, but that is Seamus Heaney. I adore the poetry of Seamus Heaney. It is absolutely beautiful. His poetry is really simple, really easily accessible for people who aren't big poetry readers. It's very focused on history and on nature, I think, are very important parts of his poems. They're very earthy and very real, very small period points in time that are about the human condition, which I suppose is kind of how poetry works. But he's talking about Northern Ireland and English rule in Northern Ireland, which I think is really important. A really important thing to read more about, particularly if you're not from Northern Ireland. Well, I think people from the Republic probably know quite a lot about it too, but people from the UK and people from outside of the UK, I feel like don't know a lot, and his poetry talks about that. I would recommend that if you are not from Northern Ireland or not particularly familiar with a Northern Irish accent, particularly a Derry accent, because he's from Derry, I would recommend that you listen to some of his poems, because I feel like the tone of his accent is really, really important to, or adds an extra layer to his poetry. When he's talking about down and ground, it just doesn't have the same tone to it as down and ground. I think that the Derry accent is really important to his poetry, since his poetry is so situated in place, and the sound is really important part of poetry. Rhythm and tone are really important. So I think if you can listen to Seamus Heaney, who has quite a subtle Derry accent, because he's from Castle Down, so he's not from Derry City. But I think that if you listen to it, you will feel the atmosphere more than if you aren't familiar with that accent yourself. Okay, so now to talk about some of the books by Irish authors that I want to read in future, hopefully soon. One of them very soon. So the first one I want to talk to you about is Days Without End by Sebastian Barry, which was in my March TBR, and I'm planning to read very, very soon. When I picked this up, I didn't know that Sebastian Barry was an Irish author. I also didn't realise I had another one of his books sitting on my shelf, The Secret Scripture, so I definitely know I need to get to Sebastian Barry soon. Apparently he won the Costa Book Awards in 2008 and 2016 with both of these books, so that is interesting. But the one I'm going to start with is Days Without End. This is about two boys who sign up in the US Army, and I didn't know this until recently, but 20,000 Irish soldiers fought during the American Civil War, a lot of them on the Confederate side. This is about Thomas McNulty and John Cole, who fight in the Indian Wars and the Civil War. Having both fled terrible hardships, their days are now vivid and filled with wonder, despite the horrors they see and are complicit in. Then, when a young Indian girl crosses their path, the possibility of lasting happiness seems within reach if only they survive. I feel like this is going to engage with Ireland's complicated history with colonialism, because of obviously Ireland being a country that was colonised by the British and experienced a lot of hardships at the hands of the British, but also Irish Americans and Irish experience in America and in the Caribbean being the other side of that coin. And so I am interested in reading that, and I've heard so many good things about it, and you know, it's a prize-winning book, so I feel like it's going to be a good one. Then I also want to read A Ghost in the Throat by Dorian Negrifa. So this is a book that I own, which is why I'm talking about it next. But this book came out last year and it was Foyle's non-fiction book of the year. And it's kind of a blend of historical fiction and autofiction, non-fiction, personal memoir. It's a very, it sounds like it's a very like genre-bending book. In the striking, inventive prose debut, Dorian Negrifa sculpts essay and autofiction to explore the deep connection between two writers centuries apart. In the 1700s, an Irish noblewoman, on discovering that her husband has been murdered, drinks handfuls of his blood and composes an extraordinary poem. In the present day, a young mother narrowly avoids tragedy. On encountering the poem, she becomes obsessed with its echoes in her own life and sets out to track down the rest of the poet's story. I write poetry myself, and Dorian Negrifa is a poet, as it mentions on the back there, and so I'm going to be really interested in the way that it talks about poetry, history, womanhood, motherhood. I feel like is going to be important parts of this book, and I love books that are just a bit weird and play with genre in that way, so I'm excited to get to this one. Another novel I want to read is Milkman by Anna Burns, which won the Booker in 2018 and is set in Northern Ireland. I feel like Northern Irish fiction in particular is something that I want to read more of because my mum is from Derry, and so more than half of my family numerically are from Derry. Read more fiction that is specifically focused on the north of Ireland. So this book has been described as amusing but ultimately deeply disquieting satire of the Troubles, which at the book's heart, a teenager whose only means of escape is literature is slowly ground down by the unwanted attentions and creeping psychopathy of the paramilitary many years her senior. This is the secret state, a place where gossips and hearsay are weaponized methods of control, contained in a novel written with both sad humour and a certain kind of fury. And that sounds really, really good. I feel like a lot of Irish books have that very dark humour. I think that Irish humour is quite dark. Like, the only way you can talk about trauma is through jokes. At least that's my experience. This is set in Belfast rather than Derry, I think, but it's kind of outside of that. It's a very surreal, strange book with not a lot of grounding in the real world, but is a satire of the Troubles. And so I think it's an important book for me to read, and an important book generally, I think. Another tragicomic book that I would like to read is Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. My mum has often described her childhood as being like Angela's Ashes, and that is obviously a joke, but I think it has some truth in it. A lot of people have said that my mum's childhood sounds like it was from the Victorian era, and it was the 1970s in Derry. Angela's Ashes is kind of auto-fiction. It's a fictionalised memoir. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, but then his family, who were Irish-American, emigrated back to Limerick, where they had been originally from. So he goes between both, and it's about poverty and his father's alcoholism, and is another classic of Irish literature that's really about like the culture and the society of the time when he was writing. So Frank McCourt himself was born again in the 1930s, so it is like 1930s, 40s Ireland, poverty in Ireland and the Catholic Church in Ireland, and that it's supposed to be very, very tragic, very sad. Lots of very sad things happen, but also has that humour. It's something that I want to read because I know so many people who love it so much. Talking about funny books now, I would like to read The Commitments by Roddy Doyle. I have read books by Roddy Doyle before, but I didn't mention them in this video as books that I've read by Irish authors, even though they were very good, because it was The Giggler Treatment and How Rover Saved Christmas, which are the two books he wrote for children that I read as a child myself. Now, if you have any children in your life, I would recommend them as well, but I feel like I really want to read a book a book for adults by Roddy Doyle. He is beloved. My dad loves Roddy Doyle so much, and so does my mum. He is like famously a very, very funny writer, and I think The Commitments has a lot of warmth and heart and soul, as it should, because it is about a soul group. So the Commitments are spreading the gospel of soul. Ably managed by Jimmy Rabelite, brilliantly coached by Joey the Lips Fagan, the twins' assault on Motown and Barrytown takes them leaps and bounds from the parish hall to the steps of the studio door. But can the Commitments live up to their name? So it's like fun, adventure, rollick, really funny, but also a bit poignant, about music and how music can help people. Great, unpretentious, funny book, and I want to read it, and then I want to watch the film. And then finally, the final book I would like to read is The Country Girls by Edna O'Brien. This is about Kate Brady and her friend Baba Brennan, who inspired a generation after generation of readers and writers as we see them struggling against the confines of rural Irish convent school, revelling in the bright lights of Dublin, and weathering the unexpected challenges of married life in London. The passion, artistry and courage of Edna O'Brien's vision in these novels, tender portraits of innocence and youth, love, passion, dreams and reality, resonate into the 21st century. I think this was published first in the 1960s, so again it is that similar time period to what Seamus Heaney was writing about, different perspective. This is focused on women and coming of age in Ireland at that time. It is a book that has so much praise that people really, really love, and I think is really going to be a good picture of the time period and of the culture of Ireland. So I really want to read that one as well. So there you go. Those are 5 books that I love, 1 poet you need to read, and 5 books that I want to read in the future. Please let me know in the comments down below what your favourite book by an Irish writer is. What would you recommend that I read next? I hope you have enjoyed this video. Please remember to give it a thumbs up if you did, and to subscribe, because I put out new videos every Wednesday, Friday and Sunday, so I will see you again soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye!